Welcome back, everybody, to our series on F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. In our last video, we read the first couple of pages of Chapter 1, established our setting of our novel out on Long Island in the 1920s. We figured out who our main character was, our narrator, Nick, and his persistent problem that people always kind of uncomfortably spill their guts and tell him their secrets, which, even though is annoying to Nick, is probably a pretty good characteristic for a narrator to have, right? In the end of Chapter 1, Nick goes and visits his cousin, Daisy, and her husband, Tom, and they kind of try to set him up with another woman, Jordan Baker, who's a professional golfer. Throughout this dinner party, Nick is kind of scandalized a little bit by their behavior, by the way that they talk, and the way that Jordan is trying to eavesdrop on the private conversation of Daisy and Tom, all stemming from the fact that Tom seems to have a mistress in New York City that Daisy suspects is calling him during dinner. At the very end of Chapter 1, we also see Gatsby for the first time ever, who, as Nick is coming home late at night after this dinner party, he sees Gatsby walking out over his lawn and reaching out towards the water. And across the bay, over towards East Egg, he sees a single green light flashing on the end of a dock. We're bringing that up now just because, hint, hint, it will become very important later on. But for today, we are going to shift gears a little bit and jump into the first couple pages of Chapter 2, which introduce us to another very iconic setting of this novel, and one that, again, was very confusing to me when I read this book in high school, so I thought we could look at it together and establish what this strange place is. All right? So let's go ahead and open on up to the first page of Chapter 2. And we'll start right at the top. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort of men who dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly creak, and comes to a rest. And immediately the ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up the impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operations from your sight. So let's pause real quick. We're in a place called the Valley of Ashes, and Nick uses some kind of poetic, descriptive language here that kind of obscures, much like the way an ash cloud might obscure something you're looking at, kind of obscures what we're really looking at. It says that this is a farm where ashes grow. It's not literally a farm. What he's referring to here is a very industrial, very poor area on Long Island. And all this ash that he's seeing, it's sort of a combination of the dust on the ground, being kicked up by the railroad and by cars speeding by. It's the exhaust kind of coming out from factories. And this defining characteristic of ashenness. I mean, think about what ashes are. They're what's kind of left behind. It's like a waste left behind from something that burns, right? And the fact that these men are sort of described as being made of ash almost suggests that they're kind of left behind. And they're kind of like crumbling out of sight all throughout. So with that in mind, let's go a little bit further. This is the second paragraph here. But above the gray land, and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. Their retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead from a pair of enormous yellow spectacles, which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist set them up there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or forgot them and moved away, but his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. And this is another thing that when I read it in high school, I was like, what the heck is going on here? what he's describing here, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, are actually a billboard for an oculist, an eye doctor. And so it's this old, abandoned billboard, probably decades old since it's been put up, and just looking out over this really bleak, dirty, dark, crumbly landscape are these two gigantic eyes that kind of watch over everything, unblinking. It's kind of creepy, right? These will come up again and again, as we'll see, so just kind of establishing them here. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small, foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, the passengers on waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There is always a halt there for at least a minute, and it was because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular restaurants with her, and leaving her at a table, sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, and when we stopped by the ash heaps, he jumped to his feet, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." So Nick and Tom are on their way to New York for some reason or another. Nick mentions that everyone kind of knows that Tom's got a girlfriend. He's got a mistress that he's cheating on Daisy with, because he's so bold. He's so out and about with this affair that he'll take her to fancy restaurants and introduce her to his friends. So it's clear that he's not really overly concerned about that information getting back to Daisy, which tells us a little bit about who he is. I think he tanked up a good deal at luncheon. He'd gotten pretty drunk at this point. And his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was that on Sunday afternoon I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence, and we walked back 100 yards along the road under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only building in sight was a small block of yellow brick sitting on the edge of a wasteland, a sort of compact main street, ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant, accompanied by a trail of ashes. The third was a garage, repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold. I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was a dust-covered wreck of a Ford, which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that the shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome, and when he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old man," said Tom, slapping him jovially on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," answered Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he doesn't," Tom said coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else after all." "I don't mean that," explained Wilson quickly. "I just meant..." His voice faded off. So Nick and Tom are walking down this sort of like abandoned sort of main street in the Valley of Ashes, and they come across a garage, a car shop. And inside, we meet for the first time George B. Wilson. And I think it's telling that when we first see him, he's described as wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He's blonde and blue-eyed. He's faintly handsome, it describes, but it also describes him as anemic. Like he's almost kind of like wasting away in front of us. And he's surrounded by dust and trash and waste. It's a very kind of sad, not very full of life, this guy. And we know why Tom and Nick are here. They're here to meet Tom's mistress. Yet when Tom walks through the door, Wilson recognizes him and says, "Hey, when are you going to sell me that car?" And what does this tell us? This tells us that Tom has been here before under the auspices of trying to sell this guy a car, which he's very desperate for because he's broke. And yet it's clear that based on what Wilson says, "Hey, are you going to sell me that car? He works pretty slow, doesn't he?" That he's kind of being strung along here by Tom. But how does Tom respond to this like rightful question of like, well, when is this car actually going to materialize? He says, well, if that's how you feel about it, then I'll sell it to someone else. And Wilson kind of has no choice but to be like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. This reveals something about Tom's personality, how he kind of always needs to be the dominant force in the room. He kind of enjoys dominating other people. Let's go ahead a little bit further and meet Tom's mistress. His voice faded off, and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on a stairs, and in a moment the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office door. She was in the middle 30s, and faintly stout, but carried her surplus flesh sensuously, as some woman can. Her face, above a spotted dress of dark blue crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly, and walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom. Notice that description. Walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. Then she wet her lips, and without turning around, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down. She kind of commands her husband what to do without even looking at him, right? There's this sort of power play happening here. Oh, sure, agreed Wilson hurriedly, and went toward the little office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and pale hair as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved close to Tom. I want to see you, said Tom intently. Get on the next train. All right. I'll meet you by the newsstand on the lower level. She nodded and moved away from him just as George Wilson emerged with 2 chairs from his office door. We waited for her down the road out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a gray, scrawny Italian child was setting torpedoes in a row along the railroad track. Terrible place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. So, it's telling, right, that Tom shows up, bosses around the husband, the wife comes down, she bosses around her husband, and then by the time he even shows up with the chairs so that people can sit down, they just leave, right? They don't even say goodbye. And before they get on the train and head to New York, Tom makes a point of saying that it's a terrible place. He clearly sees this sort of like working class industrial town as far below him. You know, he's sort of the East Egg High society. And maybe that leads him to treat these people the way that he does. I mean, he's running around with this woman as his mistress. He's misleading, lying to, it's seeming like joyfully lying to this man, George Wilson, in the garage. He's clearly not overly concerned with the well-being of the people in this part of town, right? Keep on reading chapter 2. You'll see that there's kind of a wild party in store for them once they get to New York. And you'll learn a little bit more about Tom and his priorities and how he views the people in his life. I hope you're enjoying the book so far, and I'll see you next time.